Protests, hatred and violence, the anti-foreigner movement damaging South Africa's image of unity. We'll examine how mass migration is creating similar tensions in different parts of the planet. I'm Martin Stanford. This is Insight. Welcome to Insight. Claims that foreigners are taking jobs and committing crimes may seem like themes of the recent populist politics of Europe and the United States. But in South Africa, they've been the basis of anti-migrant protests for years. Very few of those demonstrations have remained peaceful. Some have even been fatal. Violence has flared up once again this year, with the Nelson Mandela Foundation criticising the authorities for allowing what it called a march of hatred. Insight's Sarah Firth reports.
Angry and unashamed, pointing the finger at foreigners, accusing them of taking their jobs and committing crimes.
I'm saying they're making our place corrupt here, so we don't want them here anymore, you understand?
They're everywhere. So what about the future for our kids?
Across the street, foreigners fight back, waving rocks and sticks.
We are living by full of peace, and if they don't need a full of peace, we are ready to fight with them.
Rubber bullets, tear gas, stun grenades, all used by police to break up the clashes between local protesters and immigrants. These are brazen and dangerous displays that seems like this and nothing new. Back in 2008, South Africa saw a wave of xenophobic violence that left more than 60 people dead. In 2015, there was another wave of similar violence. Again, people died. This recent flare-up of xenophobic sentiment has seen shops and businesses owned by foreigners targeted. The victims, mainly nationals from African countries, Nigeria, Ethiopia and Somalia. Immigrants say they face daily harassment and claim those behind the violence often go unpunished. We spoke to a prominent South African journalist who tells us that isn't helping. You said that even in a majority black country, the government is not decisive or unequivocal in its condemnation, instead choosing to sanitize the xenophobia. That's a very serious allegation. In your view, what is the government doing wrong here in dealing with this situation?
Well, firstly, they're not calling it what it is. You can't call this minor tension when people have lost their lives and foreign nationals have had their businesses looted. They have been threatened. Some have been killed. There was a man literally who was set alight in broad daylight, the brazenness of that. Nobody has accounted for that murder. Nobody has been prosecuted. Why is the government not agitated that under its watch, a human being was set alight?
What would the government have to gain by not tackling the issue of xenophobia and the attacks that we've seen take place head on?
The party that is in government right now is the ANC. Much of its constituency resides in the townships and rural South Africa, and these are the areas that are populated by black foreign nationals. Now, for the government to call this xenophobia and condemn it decisively, it would have to butt heads and go against its constituency. The simple answer is they don't want to lose the votes.
Authorities, though, are trying to rally. South Africa and Nigeria are putting on a united front and announced the creation of a task force to monitor the current situation.
Early warning unit that we'll set up to meet in both countries every 3 months. And so that, one, we have this whole issue on the front burner, that we don't take our eyes off that ball, and that so that whatever action, preventive or otherwise measures that need to be taken can very quickly be taken.
But South Africa remains a country with one of the highest rates of unemployment in the world. standing at around 26% of the population. The majority of those unemployed are young and from impoverished backgrounds. That creates fertile territory for what's happening here. The unemployed laying the blame at the doors of businesses and homes owned by foreigners. South Africa's been dubbed the Rainbow Nation and described as the jewel of democracy on the African continent. That image, though, doesn't sit well with what's taking place right now. South Africa's streets, again clouded by violent xenophobic attacks against foreigners. Sarah Firth reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by Thamsanqa Zhu, who's an Africa analyst, and also joining us from Johannesburg in South Africa on Skype is Dewa Mavinga, who is the Southern Africa Director for Human Rights Watch. Dewa, why do you think the government is reluctant to criticise the nature and the violence involved in these anti-immigrant protests?
Well, clearly, one of the reasons has to do with the need to keep political support amongst those in the townships and in rural South Africa where foreign nationals are. You would also find that it's not only about the reluctance to condemn, but we have had cases of senior public officials who have actually influenced xenophobic sentiment. So, for example, in March 2015, the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, was on record as saying foreign nationals should leave South Africa because they're responsible for crime. More recently, this year in Johannesburg, the mayor of Johannesburg, Herman Mashaba of the DA, Democratic Alliance, was also saying that foreign nationals are responsible for crime, illegal foreign nationals. So there is that sentiment at senior leadership where people are apportioning blame to foreign nationals for the challenges that they face as a nation.
Thamsanqa, that criticism you could see politically is like dynamite, but is it based in fact? Are most crimes committed by immigrants?
No, that is not the case. Every community has its own problems. There will be people always in the minority who are committing crime. That is also the case with people that live in South Africa who originally are were not citizens of South Africa, but they are always in a minority. But when a government is failing, you see, South Africa is facing problems of a political nature and also problems of an economic nature. And it's a government that is struggling to actually deliver to those people that are on the ground, whether in education, in creating jobs. Of course, President Jacob Zuma did say that that was a legacy of apartheid. But now when you have people that are squeezed, it's not only in South Africa. You have seen that in the United Kingdom with Brexit, foreigners being blamed for the economic problems. In America, what President Trump is talking about, America First, blaming Mexicans, blaming everybody else. The countries whose economies are struggling tend to blame foreigners for those things, but this is not backed by facts. It is just a narrative that is taken forward, normally believed by the people who will then act on it. Because for the South African who wants a job, who wants to feed his children, and if he is consistently being told, like what Dewa is saying, that the blame lies with that Nigerian immigrant or Zimbabwean or South African or Mozambican or Malawian, they will take that law into their own hands. And the government now is struggling to control that.
Dewa, if it is the case that South Africa, well, it is the case that they have such a high level of unemployment, why do people still migrate there? What is the purpose of a Nigerian ending up in South Africa today?
Well, the reality is that South Africa has strong institutions relatively. So even as it is struggling with economic challenges, South Africa is better off when you compare it with the rest of the continent. South Africa is one of the strongest economies in Africa. So there is that attraction. And also in terms of relative political stability, if you compare South Africa with its neighbors, Zimbabwe, the economy has virtually collapsed. There is no functionality there. The political situation is just chaotic. So you would find that huge numbers of Zimbabweans, Malawians, and Mozambicans will continue to risk everything and flock to South Africa in the hope of a better life. And this then brings more pressure on South Africa's limited resources. But we're also saying that perhaps South Africa could be looking to say, how can it support stability in its neighboring countries so that the flows of migrants would not continue to go southwards, but people can stay in their own countries. So that's another role for South Africa as a regional power bloc.
I mean, this is the economics of migration is much discussed and much argued over, isn't it? But also, there are various systems around the world which seem to work better than others. The points-based system, for instance, that Australia has used, whereby particular skills are encouraged to come to the country where the migrant benefits and Australia benefits. Is it even possible to conceive that South Africa should try and put something like that into place?
Absolutely. The challenge for South Africa has been twofold. Firstly, South Africa has failed to do something about uncontrolled immigration in the sense that at the very tail end, following xenophobic violence, South Africa did attempt to have a special dispensation of permits, work permits for Zimbabweans illegally in South Africa and also for people from Lesotho. So certainly South Africa could learn from some of those systems, such as the one that has been used in Australia. The challenge is that South Africa cannot afford to do nothing about this crisis because these waves of xenophobic violence will continue to recur. And already in the past, in 2008, we saw that 60 people were left dead as a result of xenophobic violence. And we could have worse or more of that. So there is need to seriously look at a comprehensive approach that seeks to regulate in a humane manner and in a human rights respecting manner the flow of migrants to South Africa.
And Tamsanqa, is there a pan-African will politically, do you think, leaders, to identify this is a real problem? It could be a real flashpoint in South Africa today, it could be in other countries tomorrow, and they need to work together more.
Yes, in all these incidents that Tewa is mentioning, there were attempts by the African leadership to find solutions presented.
Just attempts, though.
Yeah. Well, they remain attempts until they are successful. But you have seen the foreign minister, the Nigerian foreign minister, Geoffrey Onyema, just now saying that in Sarah's report, talking about the joint commission that they are having to identify these things proactively. And we know that in Zimbabwe, for instance, Zimbabweans themselves are trying to solve their political situation because I think to understand what is going on in South Africa, a lot of Nigerians in the 90s, 93, 94, 95, were in Zimbabwe. Until things started going bad in Zimbabwe, a lot of people flocked west.
And then they went away.
And then they started going south. Mozambicans, Malawians, Zambians, a lot of people in Southern Africa used to go to Zimbabwe. South Africa, even before the end of the apartheid, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Swaziland were the places, and Mozambique, were the places where a lot of South Africans used to go. So what you are having is, when the taps opened in Zimbabwe because of the problems, then South Africa felt the pressure. But if problems are solved in all these other countries, and they work together like they're doing with Nigeria, then things are going to work well.
That's clearly the challenge they face.
Yeah, but South Africans need to appreciate that their interest also, especially economic interest in their companies, are in Nigeria, MTN, you're talking of DSTV, you're talking of huge companies that are making sure that the South African economy remains viable. So their interests lie also elsewhere.
Okay, we're going to continue our discussion in just a moment. Coming up, we'll examine some of the largest migrant communities in other countries right around the world.